Everything seemed normal on the flight until a flight attendant suddenly yelled at a young boy. The passengers were shocked, but no one could have predicted what would happen next. Just 10 minutes later, she was fired right in front of everyone. What went so wrong on that flight? Stay with us to find out before we start the story. Comment below where in the world you're watching from today, and if you enjoy this story, don't forget to subscribe for more. The cabin buzzed with familiar pre-flight activity. Luggage was neatly stowed, seats adjusted, and quiet conversations filled the air. Among the passengers sat a young boy named Cassius beside his mother Aurelia. His eyes shone with wonder as he peered out the window, his small hand gripping the armrest in excitement. It was his very first flight, and he peppered his mother with endless questions about the plane's workings, the soaring heights, and the fluffy shapes of the clouds above. Aurelia answered each question with gentle warmth and the patience of a loving parent, clearly proud to share this special moment with her son. Cassius sported a vibrant shirt and jeans with his favorite backpack resting on his lap, a small bundle containing snacks, a drawing book, and a few well-chosen toys. Aurelia, a devoted single mother, had meticulously planned this trip for months, saving every spare penny to create a memorable escape for them both. She looked effortlessly elegant in a simple blouse, her hair neatly tied back, wearing a calm expression that hinted at both determination and a touch of fatigue. The flight was supposed to be the beginning of a well-deserved break for the two of them. As Cassius leaned slightly into the aisle to get a better view of the cabin, a flight attendant named Celestine walked past briskly. Celestine, in her mid-40s with a crisply pressed uniform and hair pulled into a severe bun, moved with a commanding air as she scanned the rows for any sign of mischief. When she noticed Cassius leaning out, her face immediately set into a hard line, and she halted in her tracks. "Sit back properly, young man," she said loudly, her voice sharp enough to catch the attention of those nearby. Cassius quickly pulled back, startled, his wide eyes now filled with confusion. Aurelia instantly stepped in, speaking softly yet firmly. "I'm sorry, ma'am. He's just excited. It's his first time on a plane." Celestine's stern gaze shifted to Aurelia as she retorted, "This isn't a playground loud enough for others to hear." Several passengers exchanged curious and uneasy glances as Aurelia's cheeks flushed with embarrassment. Gently placing her hand on Cassius' shoulder, she assured him, "It won't happen again." But Celestine remained unsatisfied. She shook her head and muttered under her breath before striding away, leaving an awkward silence behind. Cassius looked up at his mother, his initial excitement now mixed with confusion and a touch of sadness. "Did I do something wrong?" he whispered. Aurelia's heart sank at his question as she comforted him. "No, baby, you didn't do anything wrong." Unbeknownst to Celestine, a man in first class had been watching the entire exchange. Dorian Blackwell, a reserved yet perceptive airline executive, had been quietly reviewing documents on his tablet until her raised voice caught his attention. His brow furrowed as he observed her demeanor and the uneasy reactions of nearby passengers, and he decided to intervene. Dorian set his tablet aside and adjusted his tie before standing up. His tall frame moved gracefully down the aisle, his eyes calm but focused as he reached the galley where Celestine was busy arranging drinks. He cleared his throat. The sound startled her, and she turned abruptly. "Excuse me," Dorian Blackwell began in a polite but firm tone. "Could I have a word with you about what just happened?" Celestine blinked, her expression shifting as she grew defensive. "Is there an issue, sir?" she asked, her voice lacking the earlier confidence as she glanced around, hoping for someone else to intervene. "Yes, there is," he replied, his tone low enough to keep the attention discreet. "I couldn't help but notice the way you spoke to that child and his mother. It seemed unnecessary and unprofessional." Celestine stiffened. "Sir, I was just doing my job. Children need to follow the rules, especially during pre-flight. Safety comes first." Dorian Blackwell nodded slightly, his gaze sharpening. I understand the importance of safety, but I also understand the importance of treating passengers with respect, especially when they haven't done anything wrong. That child wasn't disrupting anyone, and your tone was entirely out of line." Celestine's cheeks flushed as she quickly looked down at the clipboard in her hand. "I wasn't trying to be disrespectful, Her words faded as she struggled to offer a clear explanation. Dorian Blackwell's voice became a touch firmer. "I've worked in this industry long enough to recognize when someone's actions are driven by more than just protocol. I'd like you to consider whether your response to that family would have been the same if they looked different." Celestine's head snapped up, her face paling slightly. I don't know what you're implying," she stammered, her grip tightening on the clipboard. "I'm not implying anything," Dorian Blackwell said steadily. "I'm asking you to think about it. And for now, I'm going to request that you focus on your duties, without further interaction with that family." "Understood," Celestine nodded stiffly, unable to muster a response. Dorian Blackwell turned and walked back toward his seat, his expression unreadable as he passed Aurelia and Cassius. He paused for a moment, giving Aurelia a small nod as if to silently assure her that she wasn't alone in this. Aurelia returned the nod cautiously, unsure of who he was but grateful for the unexpected acknowledgement. Cassius, who had been busy sketching in his drawing book to distract himself, didn't notice the exchange. Meanwhile, passengers nearby began whispering among themselves, some clearly aware that something significant was unfolding. Celestine stood frozen in the galley, her mind racing as she realized this wasn't an ordinary passenger. The weight of Dorian Blackwell's words settled over her, but she wasn't sure if she was ready to fully understand their meaning. Celestine returned to her duties with a forced smile, but her movements were stiffer, her confidence visibly shaken. She tried to carry on as though nothing had happened, but every glance from a passenger felt heavier than usual. Her earlier certainty now felt like quicksand beneath her feet. Despite her efforts, she couldn't shake the growing unease. No sooner had this settled than Dorian Blackwell pulled out his phone and sent a discreet message to one of his colleagues on the ground. He explained the situation briefly and requested a report on Celestine's history with the airline. Dorian Blackwell wasn't one to act impulsively, but he knew there was more to the story than what he had witnessed. This wasn't just about a single interaction. It was about ensuring the airline upheld its values. Aurelia noticed the subtle tension brewing around her. She could feel the eyes of other passengers lingering, some offering sympathetic smiles while others quickly turned away. When she glanced back, she leaned down to Cassius, who was busy coloring in his sketchbook, and whispered, "You're doing great, sweetheart. Just keep drawing, okay?" Cassius nodded, his small hands carefully shading in the edges of a cloud. The cabin grew quieter as the last few passengers settled in, but the atmosphere remained charged. Celestine's action had shifted the energy on board, and the subtle discomfort was palpable. In first class, Dorian Blackwell remained composed, his focus unwavering as he monitored the situation. Minutes later, Celestine entered the galley again to prepare for takeoff, her hands trembling slightly as she arranged the beverage cart. Another flight attendant, Elowen, stepped in to assist her. Elowen was younger and had a more relaxed demeanor. Her bright smile was a stark contrast to Celestine's strained expression. "Are you okay?" Elowen asked softly, noticing Celestine's unease. "I'm fine," Celestine snapped, though her tone betrayed her nerves. She quickly busied herself, avoiding Elowen's gaze. Elowen didn't push further, but exchanged a concerned glance with another crew member nearby. The growing tension was hard to ignore, and Elowen had a sinking feeling that this wasn't just about a routine conflict with a passenger. Back in the main cabin, Aurelia adjusted her seat and glanced at Cassius, who had begun to hum softly as he sketched. She leaned back and closed her eyes, taking a deep breath. She wanted to let the incident go, But the memory of Celestine's harsh words lingered. It wasn't just what had been said, it was how it had made her feel, as though she and her son didn't belong. Dorian Blackwell, now seated, glanced out of the corner of his eye toward the galley. He saw Elowin quietly speaking with another crew member. Their faces were tense. He had seen this before, the quiet ripples of discontent spreading through a team. If there was one thing he knew, it was that unresolved issues like this could escalate quickly. As the plane prepared for takeoff, Dorian Blackwell's phone vibrated in his pocket. He pulled it out discreetly and read the message from his colleague. The report on Celestine was brief but revealing. This wasn't her first complaint about inappropriate behavior. Dorian Blackwell's jaw tightened as he realized this wasn't just a one-time lapse in judgment. It was a pattern. He slipped the phone back into his pocket, his decision now clear. This wasn't going to wait until the plane landed. He leaned back in his seat, his mind calculating the next steps for Celestine. The next few minutes would define her career, and she didn't even know it yet. The plane had taken off smoothly and the cabin lights dimmed slightly as the crew moved through the aisles, ensuring passengers were comfortable. Celestine avoided eye contact with the passengers in Cassius and Aurelia's row, focusing instead on first class. Her face was tight with forced composure, but inside her nerves were unraveling. She couldn't stop replaying Dorian Blackwell's words, each one digging deeper into her confidence. In the main cabin, Aurelia watched as a different flight attendant, Elowin, stopped by with a kind smile. "Hi there, Elowin," Aurelia said softly. "Is there anything I can get for you or your son?" Aurelia hesitated, then shook her head. "We're fine, thank you," she replied, though her voice carried an edge of weariness. Elowin's warm smile didn't waver. She crouched slightly to meet Cassius's eye level. "What are you drawing, buddy?" she asked gently. Cassius looked up, his big eyes lighting up as he held up his sketch pad. "It's a plane, flying through the clouds," he said proudly. Elowin nodded, her smile widening. "That's amazing. You've got real talent," she said in a genuine tone. Aurelia felt a rush of gratitude for Elowin's kindness. It was a small gesture, but it helped ease the sting of Celestine's earlier behavior. Elowin gave Aurelia a reassuring nod before moving on to the next row. As she left, Aurelia noticed a few other passengers giving her encouraging smiles. It wasn't much, but it reminded her that she wasn't alone in first class. Dorian Blackwell signaled for another flight attendant, a seasoned crew member named Leander. Leander leaned in as Dorian Blackwell spoke, quietly but firmly. "I need you to coordinate with the captain and inform him that there's an issue we need to address. Tell him it's about a crew member's behavior and that it's urgent." Leander's brow furrowed, but he nodded without question. "Understood, sir," he said, before heading toward the cockpit. Dorian Blackwell sat back and folded his hands, his expression calm but resolute. He wasn't going to let this slide, and he knew the only way to make a real impact was to act decisively. As the plane cruised at 300 feet, Celestine was in the galley, fidgeting with the service tray. She could feel the weight of Dorian Blackwell's earlier words pressing down on her, but she pushed the thought aside. "Just get through the flight," she muttered under her breath. But her reprieve was short-lived. Leander returned, turning from the cockpit with a serious expression. He leaned into Celestine's ear and spoke in a low voice. "The captain wants to see you in the galley immediately." Celestine froze, her hands gripping the tray tightly. "Why?" she asked, her voice sharper than intended. Leander shrugged slightly. "He didn't say, but it sounds important." Heart pounding, Celestine straightened her uniform and followed Leander to the galley near the cockpit. When she arrived, the captain stood there, his arms crossed, his face unreadable. Dorian Blackwell was seated nearby. his gaze steady as he watched the interaction unfold. "Celestine," the captain began in a calm but firm voice, "we've been made aware of an incident involving a passenger in the main cabin. Mr. Blackwell has raised concerns about your behavior, and we need to address it immediately." Celestine's face went pale. "Sir, I don't understand. I was just doing my job," she protested weakly. The captain held up a hand to stop her. "This is not the time for excuses. I've been briefed on this, and based on Mr. Blackwell's account, there are serious questions about your conduct. We will be documenting this and addressing it officially once we land." Celestine's breath quickened, but she started to argue. But Dorian Blackwell interrupted. His voice was calm but carried the weight of authority. "Celestine, this isn't just about you. It's about the values this airline stands for, and right now your actions don't align with those values." Celestine looked from Dorian Blackwell to the captain, her heart sinking as the realization dawned that this wasn't going to blow over. She was in real trouble, and everyone in the cabin would soon know it. Celestine stood frozen in the galley, her chest tightening as the captain's words echoed in her mind. The weight of the moment pressed heavily on her shoulders, but she wasn't sure if it was fear, guilt, or anger that consumed her the most. She opened her mouth to respond, but before she could, the captain's sharp gaze silenced her. "We'll discuss this further once we land," he said firmly. "In the meantime, I want you to remain professional and avoid further escalation." Dorian Blackwell remained seated nearby, his calm demeanor unchanged. His presence alone seemed to sap Celestine of any lingering confidence. She gave a stiff nod and mumbled, "Understood," before turning to leave the galley. Her steps were unsteady as she made her way back to her station. For the first time in her career, she felt entirely out of control. Back in the main cabin, Aurelia noticed the subtle shift in the flight crew's behavior. Elowen and another flight attendant were noticeably more attentive, offering refills, snacks, and even warm smiles to passengers who hadn't asked for anything, as if they were trying to undo the damage Celestine had caused. Aurelia, however, remained wary. Her trust had been shaken, and while she appreciated Elowen's kindness, the earlier humiliation lingered. Meanwhile, Cassius seemed to have moved on. He was busy adding more details to his drawing, oblivious to the tension that still hung in the air. The calm didn't last long. A chime rang through the cabin, followed by the captain's voice over the intercom. "Ladies and gentlemen, I'd like to thank you for flying with us today. We've been alerted to a matter involving our onboard service, and I want to assure you that it's being handled with the utmost seriousness. We deeply value each of you as passengers and are committed to ensuring a respectful and enjoyable flight experience for everyone." The message was brief, but its tone was unmistakable. Passengers began exchanging curious glances and whispering among themselves. Aurelia looked around, trying to gauge the reaction of those nearby. Some looked puzzled, while others appeared to piece together what was happening. A man seated across the aisle leaned toward Aurelia and said quietly, "I think they're talking about what happened earlier." Aurelia nodded slightly, but didn't respond. She felt a strange mixture of relief and unease. On one hand, it seemed like justice might be served. On the other, she wasn't sure how public the fallout would become, or how it would affect her and Cassius. Celestine, who had returned to the galley, heard the captain's announcement and felt her stomach drop. She knew the message was directed at her, even if her name wasn't mentioned. Her hands trembled as she clutched the edge of the counter, her mind racing. The passengers knew something was wrong, and all eyes would be on her. Meanwhile, Dorian Blackwell sent another discreet message to his team on the ground. He requested that a senior HR representative be present upon landing, ensuring the situation was addressed swiftly and formally. He had no intention of letting this fade into the background. Actions like Celestine's didn't just affect the people involved. They reflected poorly on the entire organization. As the cabin returned to a tentative quiet, Dorian Blackwell glanced toward Aurelia and Cassius. Aurelia caught his eye and nodded a silent acknowledgement of his efforts. Dorian Blackwell gave her a reassuring nod in return. The wheels were already in motion, and the outcome was no longer up to Celestine. The only question now was how much she would lose before the flight ended. Celestine tried to steady her hands as she moved through the first-class cabin, attempting to regain a sense of normalcy. She poured drinks with mechanical precision, avoided eye contact, and forced a tight-lipped smile at passengers who thanked her, but no amount of professional routine could mask the unease radiating from her. She knew the captain's announcement had shifted the cabin's mood, and her role in the brewing tension was no secret. In the main cabin, Aurelia glanced at Cassius, who was now engrossed in adding color to his sketch. She wanted to shield him from any further drama, but her heart ached at the memory of Celestine's harsh tone and dismissive attitude. She could feel the weight of stares and whispers from nearby passengers, many of whom had witnessed the earlier exchange. Some smiled at her reassuringly, while others simply looked on with quiet curiosity. Aurelia turned her gaze toward the front of the plane, where Dorian Blackwell sat in calm conversation with a crew member. She didn't know who he was, but his subtle nods and the difference shown to him by the staff hinted at his importance. She had caught the faint exchange of words earlier, in the galley, and suspected that Dorian Blackwell wasn't just another passenger. Whoever he was, he seemed determined to set things right, and for that, she felt a small glimmer of hope. Meanwhile, Elowen made her way to the rear galley where Celestine was standing stiffly, pretending to check the inventory. Elowen hesitated for a moment before speaking. "Careful, are you okay?" Celestine glanced at her but didn't respond immediately. Finally, she muttered, "I'm fine, just tired. It's been a long day." Elowen studied her for a moment, unsure whether to press further. "If you need to step away for a bit, I can cover for you," she offered in a kind but cautious voice. Celestine's jaw tightened. "I don't need you to cover for me," she snapped, though her voice cracked slightly at the end. She immediately regretted the sharpness in her tone, but didn't apologize. Elowen blinked, taken aback, and stepped back without another word. The tension between the two was palpable. Unbeknownst to Celestine, passengers in the cabin were becoming more aware of her demeanor. Her stiffness and avoidance stood out, especially against the backdrop of Elowen's warmth and attentiveness. Aurelia caught a glimpse of Celestine in the galley, her rigid posture betraying her discomfort. She wondered if the flight attendant was beginning to grasp the gravity of her actions. Meanwhile, Dorian Blackwell had returned to his seat, but his attention was far from the movie playing on the screen in front of him. His phone buzzed with a new message. He glanced at the screen and saw an update from his team. On-site security had been notified to assist if necessary, and a senior HR representative was awaiting landing for further action. Dorian Blackwell read the message, his expression unreadable. He tucked his phone back into his pocket and leaned back in his seat, mentally preparing for what lay ahead. He had dealt with situations like this before, but they never became easier. Watching someone face the consequences of their actions was necessary, but rarely pleasant. As the plane cruised at 300 feet, Celestine felt a growing sense of dread. The captain's stern words, Dorian Blackwell's quiet authority, and the whispers among passengers all pointed to an outcome she couldn't control. Her pride kept her from admitting fault, but deep down, she felt the weight of regret. She had always prided herself on being firm but fair, a professional who followed the rules. Yet today, something in her had snapped, and now she was paying the price. Back in the main cabin, and Cassius suddenly looked up from his drawing. "Mom, are we in the clouds yet?" he asked, his voice tinged with excitement. Aurelia smiled softly and nodded. "We are, baby. Look out the window." Cassius pressed his face against the window, his earlier joy returning as he stared at the endless expanse of white. His innocent curiosity melted some of Aurelia's tension, but the memory of the incident still lingered. She glanced at her watch, silently willing the flight to land sooner. Celestine, too, watched the minutes tick by, each one stretching longer than the last. The hum of the engines and the muffled sounds of passengers' chatter did nothing to quiet her racing thoughts. She replayed the events of the day in her mind, trying to pinpoint where things had gone wrong. But the truth was inescapable. She had made assumptions, snapped judgments that were now unraveling her carefully built career. As the plane's intercom chimed again, signaling the crew to prepare for descent, Celestine's heart sank further. She could feel the end of the flight drawing near, and with it, the reckoning she could no longer avoid. Meanwhile, Dorian Blackwell sat calmly in his seat. Aurelia comforted Cassius as he stared out the window, and the entire cabin seemed to hold its breath, waiting for what would happen next. The intercom announcement for descent heightened the tension in the cabin. Flight attendants began their final checks, moving through the aisles to ensure seatbelts were fastened and tray tables were stowed. Elowen's kind demeanor stood in stark contrast to Celestine's rigid, almost mechanical movements. Passengers couldn't help but notice the difference, exchanging glances as Celestine avoided even the most basic interactions. Aurelia adjusted Cassius's seatbelt, her hands steady despite the tight knot in her stomach. She wanted to forget the earlier humiliation, but every time she glanced toward the galley, the image of Celestine's sharp expression and raised voice replayed in her mind. Cassius seemed blissfully unaware of the ongoing tension. His attention was still fixed on the window, and his excitement about being in the clouds brought a bittersweet smile to Aurelia's face. She wished his first flight had been nothing but joy. In first class, Dorian Blackwell was seated upright, his phone vibrating softly against his palm. Another message had arrived from his team. Security and HR were positioned at the gate, prepared to act as soon as the flight landed. Please advise if further instructions are needed. Dorian Blackwell responded with a simple, "Proceed, it's planned." He slipped the phone back into his pocket and took a deep breath, his expression firm. He had spent years ensuring that the airline maintained its reputation for customer care and professionalism. This incident wasn't just a breach of those values. It was a personal affront to everything he had worked for. Today, he intended to send a clear message, not just to Celestine, but to the entire staff, that this kind of behavior would not be tolerated. As the plane began its descent, the tension in the cabin grew thicker. Celestine moved through her tasks like a robot, her mind spinning with possibilities. She glanced toward the cockpit, hoping for some reassurance from the captain, but he was busy coordinating the landing. She could feel Dorian Blackwell's eyes on her from first class, though he remained seated, his expression unreadable. Passengers in the main cabin noticed the shift as well. Whispers became louder and curious glances were exchanged. One man leaned toward Aurelia and said quietly, "Do you think she's in trouble?" He gestured discreetly toward Celestine. Aurelia hesitated before answering softly, "I don't know," her eyes flickering toward Celestine, but someone was definitely paying attention. Celestine felt those glances like 1,000 tiny pricks against her skin. The usual authority she carried as a senior flight attendant had vanished, replaced by a gnawing sense of vulnerability. She tried to focus on the final safety checks, but her hands trembled as she buckled a passenger's seatbelt. The man gave her a strange look but said nothing. The plane touched down smoothly, and a collective sigh of relief rippled through the cabin. For most passengers, the flight had been uneventful, save for the tense undercurrent created by Celestine's earlier outburst. As the plane taxied to the gate, Dorian Blackwell stood and retrieved his briefcase. His movements were deliberate as he made his way to the galley near the cockpit, where Celestine stood stiffly, her eyes downcast. "Beston," Dorian Blackwell said in a quiet but firm tone. "Once we're at the gate, I'll need you to step aside and speak with me and the captain." Celestine's throat tightened, but she managed a weak nod. "Yes, sir," she whispered, her voice barely audible. The words "speak with me" felt ominous, and she could feel her palms sweating. Passengers began to unbuckle their seatbelts as the plane came to a full stop. The cabin crew opened the doors, and the cool air of the jet bridge swept into the plane. People stood, reaching for their luggage in the overhead bins. Celestine stayed rooted in place, her hands clutching the edge of a counter. She didn't dare meet anyone's gaze. Dorian Blackwell stepped aside to allow passengers to disembark, but his eyes remained on Celestine. Aurelia and Cassius gathered their belongings, ready to join the line of people exiting the plane. As they reached the aisle, Elowen stopped them with a warm smile. "Thank you for flying with us," she said gently. "I hope the rest of your trip is wonderful." Aurelia returned the smile, appreciating the sincerity in Elowen's tone. She glanced back once at Celestine, who was still standing frozen in the galley. Celestine's rigid form was a stark reminder of the earlier conflict, but Aurelia pushed the thought aside, focusing instead on her son. Cassius grinned as they stepped into the jet bridge, his excitement about their destination overpowering any lingering discomfort. But not everyone could move on so easily. As the last passenger exited, Dorian Blackwell nodded toward the HR representative waiting just outside the plane door. A man in a crisp suit stepped inside, flanked by 2 security personnel. The HR representative's calm but firm demeanor mirrored Dorian Blackwell's. Celestine's eyes widened as she realized what was happening. Her stomach twisted with dread. "Percival," the HR representative began, his voice professional but unyielding. "We've been informed of an incident during this flight involving a passenger. We will need to have a formal discussion about this immediately." Celestine's face drained of color. She opened her mouth to respond, but no words came out. Dorian Blackwell stepped forward, his voice cutting through the thick silence. "Celestine, your actions today reflect poorly on this airline and everything it stands for. There will be an investigation, but based on what I've witnessed, your behavior is unacceptable." The passengers who had lingered just beyond the jet bridge turned their eyes wide as they caught sight of the scene. Whispers started again, louder this time, as Celestine stood frozen. The HR representative gestured toward the exit. "Please follow us, Miss Smith," he said firmly. Celestine hesitated, glancing around as though searching for someone to defend her, but no one stepped forward. Elowen avoided her gaze, and the other crew members remained silent. Finally, Celestine took a shaky step forward, her shoulders slumping in defeat as she followed the HR team and security personnel off the plane. Dorian Blackwell stood silently, watching her go. His expression remained calm, but there was a flicker of disappointment in his eyes. He turned to Elowen and the other crew members. "Thank you for handling the situation professionally," he said simply, before stepping off the plane himself in the terminal. Aurelia and Cassius waited near the baggage claim. Cassius had resumed sketching, his head bowed over his notebook. Aurelia glanced around, noticing the buzz among other passengers as they discussed what had just unfolded. She wasn't sure how to feel. Part of her was relieved that someone had stepped in, but another part of her felt exhausted by the entire ordeal. She glanced at her son and decided that, for now, she would focus on him and the memories they were about to create on their trip. Meanwhile, Celestine disappeared into the airport's administrative offices, her fate now in the hands of HR and the airline's policies. The terminal slowly returned to its usual rhythm, but for those who had witnessed what happened, the flight was one they wouldn't forget. For Dorian Blackwell, Aurelia, and even Celestine, the repercussions of this day were just beginning to unfold. Inside the airport's administrative offices, Celestine sat in a small, starkly lit room. The HR representative and 2 security personnel stood nearby, their expressions neutral but firm. The weight of the situation pressed heavily on her as she shifted uncomfortably in her seat. Her usually sharp posture had wilted, and her hands were clasped tightly in her lap. She had never felt more out of place in her own uniform. The HR representative, a man named Percival, sat across from her, a folder of documents resting neatly on the table between them. His demeanor was professional but unyielding, leaving no room for misunderstanding. "Ms. Celestine," he began, flipping open the folder, "we are here to address a complaint that was formally raised during your flight. This pertains to your behavior toward a passenger and their child." Celestine swallowed hard, her throat dry. She opened her mouth to respond, but Percival continued before she could speak. "We have statements from multiple witnesses, including a senior airline executive who was present on the flight. The accounts are consistent. Your actions were inappropriate and unprofessional, and they do not align with the standards of our airline." Celestine's voice wavered as she finally spoke. I didn't mean for it to escalate like this. I was just trying to enforce the rules. That child was leaning into the aisle and..." Percival held up a hand, silencing her. "Miss Celestine, enforcing safety rules is part of your job, but the way you handled passengers matters just as much. This wasn't about safety, it was about your tone, your attitude, and the assumptions you made about that family." Celestine's eyes darted to the security personnel who stood silently by the door. She felt trapped, her words crumbling under the weight of Percival's calm authority. "I've been with this airline for years," she pleaded, her voice trembling. "This was just a misunderstanding." Percival leaned forward slightly, his gaze unwavering. "Your record shows that this isn't the first time concerns have been raised about your interactions with passengers. While those incidents were resolved with warnings, this time is different. This time, a senior executive witnessed the behavior firsthand, and the impact on the passengers involved cannot be ignored." Celestine's stomach churned as Percival's words sank in. She had always assumed her seniority would shield her from serious consequences. But now, for the first time, she realized just how precarious her position had become. "Please," she said, her voice trembling. "I'm willing to apologize to the family. I'll do whatever it takes to fix this." Percival's expression softened, but only slightly. "Apologies are important, Miss Celestine, but they can't undo what's been done. This incident has already reached the airline's executive board, and they've made it clear that actions need to be taken to uphold our commitment to respect and fairness." Celestine's chest tightened. Aurelia and Cassius waited near the baggage claim. Cassius had resumed sketching, his head bowed over his notebook. Aurelia glanced around, noticing the buzz among other passengers as they discussed what had just unfolded. She wasn't sure how to feel. Part of her was relieved that someone had stepped in, but another part of her felt exhausted by the entire ordeal. She glanced at her son and decided that, for now, she would focus on him and the memories they were about to create on their trip. Meanwhile, Celestine disappeared into the airport's administrative offices, her fate now in the hands of HR and the airline's policies. The terminal slowly returned to its usual rhythm, but for those who had witnessed what happened, the flight was one they wouldn't forget. For Dorian, Blackwell, Aurelia, and even Celestine, the repercussions of this day were just beginning to unfold. Inside the administrative offices, Celestine sat in a small, starkly lit room. The HR representative, Percival, and two security personnel stood nearby, their expressions neutral but firm. The weight of the situation pressed heavily on her as she shifted uncomfortably in her seat. Her usually sharp posture had wilted, and her hands were clasped tightly in her lap. She had always believed she was untouchable, a reliable, long-term employee who could weather any storm. But now, as Percival's words echoed in her mind, she saw how her own actions had brought her to this point. Meanwhile, back in the terminal, Aurelia and Cassius waited for their luggage. Aurelia sat on a bench, watching her son carefully sketch a bird he had seen during their drive to the airport. His small, concentrated face brought her a sense of calm she desperately needed after the chaos of the flight. A woman, one of the passengers who had been seated nearby during the incident, approached her. "Excuse me," the woman said gently. "I just wanted to say, I think you handled yourself with a lot of grace back there. I'm sorry for what you and your son went through." Aurelia offered a small, tired smile. "Thank you. That means a lot," she said quietly. She appreciated the support, but wished it hadn't been necessary in the first place. The woman hesitated before continuing. "I think it's good that someone noticed and stepped in. That man from first class, do you know who he is?" Aurelia shook her head. "I don't, but I'm grateful he was there. He seemed to understand what needed to be done at that moment." Meanwhile, Dorian Blackwell himself walked through the terminal, his expression composed but thoughtful. He spotted Aurelia and Cassius near the luggage carousel and made his way toward them. When he reached them, he paused, giving Aurelia a respectful nod. "I just wanted to check in and make sure you and your son are doing okay," Dorian Blackwell said, his voice calm and steady. Aurelia looked up, surprised but grateful. "We're okay, thank you. I appreciate you stepping in back there." Dorian Blackwell smiled faintly. "It was the right thing to do. No one should have to go through what you did today." He crouched slightly to meet Cassius' eye level. "And you, young man, are you still drawing?" Cassius nodded eagerly and held up his sketchbook. "I drew the plane in the clouds, and now I'm drawing a bird we saw earlier." Dorian Blackwell's smile widened. "You're very talented. Keep at it." He straightened and turned back to Aurelia. "I want to assure you that the airline is taking this matter seriously. We'll be conducting a full review to make sure something like this doesn't happen again." Aurelia nodded, her expression softening. "That means a lot, thank you." As Dorian Blackwell walked away, Aurelia felt a small weight lift from her shoulders. She didn't know what the final outcome would be, but she felt a sense of validation. Someone had seen her and Cassius for who they were, and that made all the difference. Back in the administrative office, Celestine sat in stunned silence as Percival delivered his final remarks. "Effective immediately, you are suspended pending a full review by the disciplinary board. You'll receive further communication regarding the next steps, but as of now, you are relieved of duty." Celestine felt the words hit her like a physical blow. She opened her mouth to argue, but nothing came out. All she could do was nod numbly, as Percival stood and gestured to the security personnel. "They'll escort you out," he said firmly. As Celestine walked through the terminal, her head low and her uniform now feeling like a burden, she caught sight of Aurelia and Cassius in the distance. Her chest tightened with a pang of regret, but she couldn't bring herself to approach them. Instead, she kept walking, knowing that her actions had set this chain of events in motion. For the first time, she understood the full impact of her choices and the consequences they carried. Celestine shuffled through the terminal, her steps heavy and uncertain. The weight of the suspension and the public humiliation hung over her like a storm cloud. She avoided the eyes of passing passengers, feeling the unspoken judgment in their curious glances as her mind raced, trying to process what had just happened. Years of service, countless flights, and the respect she had once commanded were gone in a matter of hours. As she reached the employee exit, Celestine paused and leaned against a wall, her breathing shallow, her hands trembling as she took out her phone, and Celestine scrolled through her messages. There were none. No support, no sympathy, not even from her co-workers. For the first time, she felt utterly alone. The realization struck her hard. The power she once wielded in her role as a senior flight attendant had been stripped away, and now she was left to face the fallout. Meanwhile, back at the luggage carousel, Aurelia and Cassius stood patiently waiting for their suitcase to appear. Cassius clutched his sketchbook tightly, occasionally flipping through the pages to show his mother his work. Aurelia smiled, her heart warmed by his enthusiasm. But the events of the flight still lingered in the back of her mind. She glanced around, noticing the subdued chatter of other passengers who had also been on the plane. The story was spreading, and it seemed everyone had something to say about what had happened. One of the passengers, a middle-aged man in a business suit, approached Aurelia hesitantly. "Excuse me," he said in a low, respectful voice. "I just wanted to say that I admire the way you handled yourself back there. It couldn't have been easy." Aurelia nodded, offering a polite smile. "Thank you. It wasn't easy, but I didn't want to make things worse for my son." The man smiled faintly, nodding in understanding. "Well, I think you set an example for him and for the rest of us," he said, then walked away. Aurelia glanced down at Cassius, who was now preoccupied with adjusting his shoelace. She reached out and smoothed his hair gently, silently hoping that the incident hadn't left a lasting impression on him. A short distance away, Dorian Blackwell stood near a gate agent, speaking quietly but with authority. "Make sure this is documented thoroughly," he instructed. "The board will want a full report including passenger statements." The gate agent nodded, taking notes on a tablet. "Understood, Mr. Blackwell. We've already flagged the incident for review and have gathered preliminary accounts from the flight crew," the agent replied. Dorian Blackwell nodded, satisfied. "If it's good, then this is about more than just one person's behavior. We need to ensure our entire staff understands that this kind of treatment is unacceptable." As the conversation ended, he turned and spotted Aurelia and Cassius at the luggage carousel. He hesitated for a moment before walking over. "Miss Carter," he said in a warm but professional tone, "I wanted to check in one more time before you leave." Aurelia looked up, surprised but grateful. "Thank you, Mr. Blackwell. We're fine, really. Cassius is excited for our trip and I just want to focus on that." Dorian Blackwell nodded, his expression softening. "I understand, but I want you to know that we're taking this seriously. What happened today was unacceptable, and I've already initiated steps to address it. You have my assurance that this won't be ignored." Aurelia appreciated his sincerity. "That means a lot," she said quietly. "I just hope this makes a difference, not just for me and Cassius, but for anyone else who might find themselves in a similar situation." Dorian Blackwell's gaze was steady. "It will. I'll make sure of it," he said as he walked away. Aurelia exhaled deeply for the first time since the flight. She felt a small sense of closure. She couldn't change what had happened, but knowing that someone in Dorian Blackwell's position was advocating for her and her son gave her a sense of validation. Elsewhere, Celestine sat in her car, parked in the farthest corner of the employee lot. She gripped the steering wheel tightly, her knuckles white. The silence around her was suffocating, broken only by the occasional hum of passing vehicles. She stared at the windshield, her mind replaying the events of the day. The words from the HR representative, the captain, and Dorian Blackwell swirling together, forming a storm of regret and anger. She reached for her phone and opened her email. After hesitating for a moment, she began typing a message addressed to the airline's HR department. The words came slowly at first, but as she wrote, they began to flow more freely. "To whom it may concern, I am writing to formally address the incident that occurred on today's flight. While I do not believe my intentions were malicious, I understand now that my actions were perceived as disrespectful and inappropriate. I acted out of frustration and poor judgment, and for that, I deeply apologize, particularly to the passenger and her son who were affected by my behavior." Celestine paused, her fingers hovering over the keyboard, and took a deep breath. "And continue, I recognize that my conduct fell far short of the standards expected of me as a senior flight attendant. I also acknowledge that this incident reflects a broader issue, one that I now understand I contributed to. I am committed to reflecting on my actions and making the necessary changes to ensure this never happens again. Celestine reread the email several times before hitting send. As the message disappeared from her screen, she leaned back in her seat, a small part of her relieved. She wasn't sure what the future held, but she knew she had to start somewhere. Back in the terminal, Aurelia and Cassius collected their suitcase and began making their way toward the exit. As they stepped out into the crisp air, Cassius looked up at his mother and smiled. "Mom, can we go to the beach first?" he asked, his voice filled with excitement. Aurelia laughed softly and nodded. "Yes, sweetheart, the beach sounds perfect." For Aurelia, the incident on the flight was already beginning to fade into the background. For Cassius, the memory of the clouds and the promise of the ocean had completely overshadowed the earlier tension. But for Celestine and Dorian Blackwell, the ripple effects of that day were only just beginning. Celestine drove away from the airport, her grip on the steering wheel tight, her mind spiraling with a mix of emotions. Guilt, frustration, and a growing sense of fear. The career she had worked so hard to build now felt as though it were slipping through her fingers. The road ahead blurred as her thoughts took over, replaying the faces of the passengers, the stern expression of Dorian Blackwell, and the quiet disappointment in the captain's voice. Her phone buzzed in the cup holder, jolting her out of her daze for a moment. She considered ignoring it, but something compelled her to check. She pulled into a quiet parking lot and picked up the phone. The message was from a former colleague, someone she hadn't spoken to in years. "Celestine, I heard what happened. Call me if you want to talk. I've been there." The words hit her like a wave, stirring up an uncomfortable mix of anger and sadness. She couldn't decide if the message was meant to comfort her or to remind her of how far she had fallen. She placed the phone back in the cup holder without responding, staring blankly at the dashboard as she sat there. She thought about what had led her to this point. She remembered the early days of her career, when she had been eager and idealistic, determined to provide passengers with the best experience possible. But somewhere along the way, the long hours, the demanding schedules, and her own personal frustrations had hardened her. She had started seeing passengers as problems to solve, rather than people to serve. And now that perspective had cost her more than she ever imagined. Across the city, Dorian Blackwell was settling into his office at the airline's headquarters. His desk was clean and orderly, with a single file folder placed squarely in the center. Inside was the report on Celestine, complete with witness statements, crew accounts, and his own observations. He flipped through the pages carefully, his face expressionless, but his mind working quickly. Dorian Blackwell had no desire to destroy someone's career. He knew the pressure flight attendants faced, the exhaustion of long shifts and demanding passengers. But he also knew that the kind of behavior Celestine had displayed couldn't be ignored. It wasn't just about one incident. It was about what it represented, a deeper issue within the airline's culture that needed to be addressed. As he read through the report, Dorian Blackwell received an email from the airline's CEO. The subject line read, "Brief incident review, immediate action required." He opened it and read the contents carefully. "Dorian Blackwell, thank you for bringing this matter to our attention. The board agrees that swift action is necessary to uphold our values. In addition to addressing the individual involved, I would like you to spearhead a review of our current training programs with a focus on sensitivity and bias awareness. Please prepare a proposal for the next board meeting. Let's ensure this becomes a learning moment for the entire organization." Dorian Blackwell leaned back in his chair, his fingers steepled in thought. The CEO's directive aligned perfectly with what he had already decided. The airline didn't just need to react to this incident, it needed to evolve. Meanwhile, Aurelia and Cassius were settling into their hotel room at their beachside destination. Cassius ran excitedly to the balcony, pressing his face against the glass as he stared at the waves crashing on the shore. "Mom, look!" he exclaimed. The ocean is so big." Aurelia smiled and joined him at the window, placing a gentle hand on his shoulder. "It is, baby, and it's all ours to enjoy this week." As Cassius began chattering about building sandcastles and collecting seashells, Aurelia's phone buzzed on the bedside table. She picked it up and saw an email notification from the airline. The subject line read, "Our apologies and next steps." She hesitated for a moment before opening it. The email was formal but heartfelt. "Dear Miss Aurelia, on behalf of the airline, I want to extend our sincerest apologies for the experience you and your son endured on Flight 287. Our passengers' comfort and dignity are our highest priorities, and we deeply regret that this was not reflected in your treatment. Please know that we are taking this matter very seriously. The flight attendant involved has been suspended pending a full review, and we are implementing immediate measures to ensure similar incidents do not occur in the future. As a token of our commitment to making this right, we have credited your account with 500 reward miles, which can be used for any future travel. Additionally, our customer relations team is available to discuss any further concerns or requests you may have. Thank you for bringing this to our attention, and we hope to regain your trust in the future." Aurelia read the email twice, her emotions mixed. The apology felt genuine, and the actions outlined seemed like a step in the right direction, but a part of her still felt the sting of the humiliation she and Cassius had faced. She placed the phone back on the table and turned to her son, deciding to focus on the joy he was radiating in that moment. Later that evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, Aurelia sat on the beach watching Cassius dig enthusiastically in the sand. Her thoughts drifted back to Dorian Blackwell, the way he had quietly stepped in to help and the professionalism he had shown in handling the situation. She didn't know if she would ever fly with the airline again, but she hoped that his efforts would make a difference for others. Back in the parking lot, Celestine remained in her car, scrolling through old photos on her phone. She paused on a picture of herself in her uniform from years ago, standing proudly in front of an airplane. She barely recognized the woman in the photo, confident, excited, and full of hope for the future. The person she'd become felt distant, as though she had lost her way for the first time since the flight. Celestine allowed herself to feel the weight of her actions fully. She thought about Cassius' wide eyes, his quiet confusion, and the protective way his mother had held him. She had taken something from them, something she couldn't give back. The realization hit her hard, and she lowered her head, tears streaming silently down her face. Meanwhile, Dorian Blackwell, now at home after a long day, sat in his living room with a laptop open. He began drafting the proposal the CEO had requested, outlining steps for a comprehensive training program that would include real-world scenarios, bias awareness, and stronger accountability measures. As he typed, he couldn't help but think about the faces of the passengers on the flight, their whispers, their glances, and the quiet strength of the woman and her son who had endured far more than they should have. The ripple effects of that day were far from over, but for Dorian Blackwell, Aurelia, Cassius, and even Celestine, the flight had become more than just an incident. It was a turning point, one that would shape the paths they would take from that moment forward. The following morning, the airline's board convened for an emergency meeting at their headquarters. Dorian Blackwell arrived early, his proposal neatly organized in a sleek black folder under his arm. The room was filled with the quiet murmur of executives exchanging pleasantries, but the tension in the air was undeniable. Everyone knew that the incident on Flight 287 had not only sparked outrage among the passengers, but it also exposed deeper flaws in the company's internal culture. As the meeting began, the CEO, Soren Nightingale, took his place at the head of the table. His usual air of confidence was tempered with a seriousness that matched the gravity of the situation. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began in a steady voice, "we are here today to address a matter that has highlighted significant gaps in our training and oversight processes. While this incident involves an individual employee, it reflects broader issues that we can no longer afford to overlook. He turned to Dorian Blackwell, nodding for him to begin. Dorian Blackwell stood, his calm demeanor commanding the room's attention. "Thank you, Soren," he said. "What happened on Flight 287 was unacceptable. The treatment of Ms. Aurelia and her son not only violated their trust as passengers, but also undermined the values we claim to uphold as an airline." Dorian Blackwell clicked a remote, projecting a slide onto the screen behind him. It displayed the core pillars of the airline's mission statement: respect, safety, and excellence. He gestured to the words as he continued. "Incidents like this erode the foundation of these principles. The way we respond now will define not only our company's reputation, but also the trust of every passenger who chooses to fly with us." The room was silent as Dorian Blackwell laid out his proposal. It included mandatory sensitivity training for all employees, a new accountability framework for handling complaints, and regular assessments to ensure compliance. He also proposed a dedicated passenger advocate team to address grievances swiftly and empathetically. "This isn't just about damage control," Dorian Blackwell concluded. "It's about fostering a culture where incidents like this are prevented, not just addressed after the fact. It's about making every employee understand the weight of their actions and the responsibility they carry as representatives of this airline." The room remained quiet for a moment before one of the board members, a woman named Mirabelle, spoke up. "Dorian, I appreciate the thoroughness of your plan, but do you think this level of intervention is necessary for what was ultimately one employee's poor decision?" Dorian Blackwell met her gaze evenly. "Yes, Mirabelle, I do. This wasn't an isolated incident. While reviewing this case, I came across other complaints. Similar issues of bias, lapses in judgment, and a lack of accountability. If we don't address the systemic problem, it's only a matter of time before something worse happens." Mirabelle nodded slowly, her expression thoughtful. Soren Nightingale leaned forward, clasping his hands together. "I agree," he said firmly. "We can't afford to view this as a one-off situation. Dorian, I want your plan implemented immediately. I'll present it to the broader leadership team this afternoon," Soren Nightingale continued. Dorian Blackwell gave a small nod, relief washing over him. The battle for change is far from over, but this is an important first step. Meanwhile, Aurelia and Cassius were enjoying their second day at the beach. The sunlight sparkled on the waves as Cassius ran along the shore, his laughter carried by the sea breeze. Aurelia watched him from a beach chair, her heart lighter than it had been in days. She had decided to put the incident behind her, focusing instead on the joy of their trip. For Cassius, the entire ordeal seemed like a distant memory. His world was now filled with sandcastles and seashells, but even as Aurelia tried to move forward, the airline's apology email lingered in her mind. It wasn't the compensation or the promise of changes that stuck with her. It was the idea that something might genuinely shift because of what happened to her and Cassius. She wanted to believe that their experience could lead to a better environment, even if the process wasn't immediate. Back in the city, Celestine sat in her small apartment, staring at her computer screen. The email she had sent to the HR department the night before remained unanswered, but she hadn't expected an immediate reply. What consumed her now was the emptiness of her inbox and the realization of how quickly her professional network had dissolved. She opened her social media accounts, scrolling through the curated lives of her colleagues and acquaintances. It was a painful contrast to her own reality. She thought about reaching out to someone, anyone, for support, but every name she considered was accompanied by the fear of rejection or judgment. Her eyes landed on a message thread with her older sister, someone she hadn't spoken to in over a year due to a falling out. Celestine hesitated, her finger hovering over the call button. Finally, she pressed it, and the phone rang. "Hello?" Her sister's voice came through, cautious but familiar. "It's me, Celestine," she said quietly. I need someone to talk to." The silence on the other end was heavy, but then her sister spoke, her tone softening. "I'm here. What's going on?" As Celestine began to talk, the words came tumbling out. Her frustration, her regret, her fear of what the future held. For the first time in a long while, she allowed herself to be vulnerable. It wasn't easy, but it felt like the beginning of something she hadn't dared to hope for. A chance to rebuild. At the same time, Dorian Blackwell sat at his desk drafting an internal memo to all staff. He chose his words carefully, knowing that the tone of the message would set the stage for the changes he intended to implement in light of recent events. "We are taking immediate steps to ensure that our airline remains a leader in professionalism, respect, and inclusivity. These values are not negotiable, and every employee is expected to embody them in their daily interactions. We will be introducing new training programs and accountability measures in the coming weeks. Participation will be mandatory for all employees, regardless of role or seniority. Together, we can create an environment where every passenger feels valued and respected. Thank you for your commitment to excellence." Dorian Blackwell sent the memo, knowing the road ahead would be challenging, but as he leaned back in his chair, he felt a sense of resolve. The events of Flight 287 had exposed weaknesses in the system, but they had also provided an opportunity to build something stronger. It was up to him and everyone in the organization to seize that opportunity and ensure it wasn't wasted. Celestine spent the rest of the day reflecting on her conversation with her sister. It had been painful to open up, but it also felt like a small step toward understanding where she had gone wrong, not just on the flight, but in how she had approached her entire career. Her sister had listened without judgment, offering quiet support and the occasional tough question that forced Celestine to confront her own biases. "You sound like you've been angry for a long time," her sister had said. "But who are you really angry at? The passengers, your job, or maybe yourself?" Celestine hadn't been able to answer right away. Now, sitting alone in her apartment, her sister's words lingered in her mind. She stared at the uniform hanging on the back of her bedroom door, a stark reminder of the identity she had built and the authority she had once wielded. It had once made her feel proud and important. Now it felt like a hollow shell of something she no longer recognized. Meanwhile, the airline was moving quickly to address the fallout from the incident. Dorian Blackwell's internal memo had sparked a flurry of activity across departments. Training managers began drafting updated sensitivity and bias training modules, while HR teams reviewed past complaints to identify patterns that might have been overlooked. The airline's legal team worked on drafting an official public statement, ensuring it conveyed sincerity without admitting liability. By late afternoon, Dorian Blackwell finally had a moment to pause. He sat in his office, sipping a cup of coffee, as he reviewed an email from Aurelia. She had written a thoughtful response to the airline's apology, expressing her appreciation for the efforts being made, while also emphasizing the importance of follow-through. "I hope these changes are not just words on paper," she had written. "As a parent, I want to believe that my son and I mattered enough to make a difference. Please continue to prioritize action over appearances." Dorian Blackwell admired her candor and added her email to the growing file of documents he planned to present at the next board meeting. Her words encapsulated exactly what he was trying to achieve: lasting, meaningful change, not just a temporary PR fix. Elsewhere, Aurelia and Cassius were enjoying their evening at the beach. Cassius had spent hours collecting seashells, his small hands carefully sorting them by size and color. He proudly showed off his collection to Aurelia, who smiled warmly and encouraged his enthusiasm. For her, this trip had become more than just a vacation. It was a chance to reset, to focus on the joy of being with her son. As the sun dipped below the horizon, turning the sky shades of pink and orange, Aurelia couldn't help but reflect on the events of the past few days. She thought about the moment Celestine had yelled at Cassius, the sharp sting of humiliation and helplessness she had felt. But she also thought about the way Dorian Blackwell had intervened, the quiet strength he had shown in holding the airline accountable. She glanced at her phone, where the airline's apology email was still open. For a moment she considered replying again, but then she decided against it. She had already said what needed to be said, and now it was up to them to prove that their words carried weight. Back in the city, Dorian Blackwell was on a video call with Soren Nightingale and several board members. The conversation had been productive but tense, with each member weighing in on the proposed changes. Soren Nightingale leaned forward, his expression serious as he addressed the group. "Let us be clear. This is about more than just one employee or one incident. This is about the culture we've allowed to take root here. If we don't take this opportunity to set a new standard, we're telling our passengers and our staff that we don't value accountability. I won't let that happen." The board members nodded, some more reluctantly than others. Dorian Blackwell spoke up in a steady but firm tone. "I agree, but we also need to ensure that these changes are sustainable. It's not enough to train people once and call it a day. We need regular assessments, open lines of communication for staff and passengers, and a commitment to continuous improvement." The meeting ended with a unanimous vote to approve Dorian Blackwell's proposal. And as the screen went dark, he allowed himself a rare moment of satisfaction. This was just the beginning, but it was a step in the right direction. That evening, Celestine received an email from the airline's HR department. The subject line was stark notice of formal disciplinary action. Her heart sank as she opened it. The message outlined the findings of the investigation. Her behavior on the flight had been deemed inappropriate and unprofessional, with multiple witness statements corroborating the incident. Effective immediately, her suspension was being extended pending a final review by the disciplinary committee. Celestine read the email twice, her chest tightening with every word. She knew this outcome was inevitable, but seeing it in writing made it feel real in a way it hadn't before. She set her phone down and stared at the uniform still hanging on her door. The person she had become while wearing it, the person who had let frustration and bias guide her actions, felt like a stranger. She picked up her phone again and opened a new email draft. This time, she wrote directly to Mr. Blackwell, whose name had been mentioned repeatedly in the HR correspondence. "Mr. Blackwell, I know you don't owe me anything, but I wanted to thank you for handling this situation with fairness. I can't change what I did, but I've started to reflect on why it happened and how I let myself get to this point. If there's any way I can contribute to the changes you're making, I'm willing to try. I want to be part of the solution, even if I can no longer be part of the team." Celestine stared at the draft for several minutes before hitting send. She didn't know if she would receive a response, but for the first time she felt like she was taking responsibility for her actions. Dorian Blackwell saw the email later that night. He read it carefully, noting the tone of genuine regret, though he didn't respond immediately. But he made a mental note to include her offer in his next meeting with the board. Redemption wasn't always easy, but sometimes it was worth considering. As Celestine sat in her quiet apartment, Aurelia and Cassius walked hand in hand along the moonlit beach, and Dorian Blackwell prepared for another long day of driving change. Each of them carried the weight of the incident in their own way. For Celestine, it was a lesson she had learned too late. For Aurelia, it was a reminder of her strength as a mother. And for Dorian Blackwell, it was a call to action that had already begun to ripple through the airline's culture. The weeks following the incident on Flight 2087 brought visible changes both for the airline and the people involved. Celestine, who had initially struggled to accept her suspension, decided to take the time away as an opportunity to reassess her priorities. She signed up for a series of workshops focused on implicit bias and emotional intelligence, and while the sessions were uncomfortable at times, they forced her to confront the patterns of behavior that had led to her downfall. In one of the workshops, the facilitator asked, "What assumptions do you make about others without even realizing it?" Celestine found herself thinking of Cassius and Aurelia, of the brief moment when she had dismissed them not as valued passengers, but as inconveniences. It was a hard truth to face, but it also became the foundation of her efforts to change. Meanwhile, Dorian Blackwell's proposal was gaining traction within the airline. The first round of mandatory sensitivity training was rolled out across all departments, and the feedback was overwhelmingly positive. Employees began sharing stories of their own biases, learning from one another in ways that hadn't been possible before. The airline also established a dedicated passenger advocacy team, a direct outcome of the incident, to address concerns with compassion and efficiency. One afternoon, Dorian Blackwell received a message from the CEO. Training launch, a success. Positive responses from staff and passengers. Thanks for your leadership on this. Dorian Blackwell smiled faintly, but he didn't allow himself to become complacent. He knew the real test would be maintaining these changes over time. For Aurelia, the incident became less of a painful memory and more of a quiet affirmation of her resilience. As the weeks passed, she focused on her work and her role as a mother, ensuring that Cassius continued to thrive. One evening, she found him at the kitchen table, carefully drawing an airplane surrounded by fluffy clouds. "Is that our plane?" she asked, sitting beside him. Cassius nodded enthusiastically. "Yeah, but I made it better, see? It has a rainbow now," he said, pointing to the colorful stripes he had added along the plane's wings. Aurelia smiled, ruffling his hair. "It's perfect," she said, her voice filled with warmth. In that moment, she realized how far they had come since the flight. While the memory of Celestine's harsh words still lingered, they had been overshadowed by the kindness of strangers, the support of the airline, and her own determination to move forward. Elsewhere, Celestine was finding her way forward. She had yet to hear the final decision from the disciplinary committee, but she had made peace with whatever the outcome might be. She had begun volunteering at a local nonprofit that focused on workplace equity, sharing her story as a cautionary tale and listening to others who had faced discrimination. It was humbling work, but it gave her a sense of purpose she hadn't felt in years. One afternoon, as she was leaving a workshop, Celestine received an email from Dorian Blackwell. The subject line read, "Next Steps." Her heart raced as she opened it. "Miss Celestine, thank you for reaching out and for the steps you've taken to reflect and grow. While your position with the airline remains under review, I believe your offer to contribute to our training efforts has value. If you're willing, I'd like to invite you to join one of our upcoming sessions as a guest speaker. Your perspective could serve as an important lesson for others and help reinforce the changes we're implementing." Celestine stared at the email, her emotions swirling. It wasn't forgiveness, not entirely, but it was a chance to take responsibility and contribute to something better. She typed a quick reply, "Thank you, Mr. Blackwell. I would be honored to help in any way I can." Months later, Celestine stood in a conference room filled with airline staff, sharing her story as part of a training session. She spoke openly about her mistakes, her assumptions, and the lessons she had learned. The room was quiet, the audience attentive. When she finished, there was a moment of silence before the room erupted into applause. It wasn't redemption, not entirely, but it was a step toward it. At the same time, Aurelia and Cassius were on another flight, this time with a different airline. As they settled into their seats, a friendly flight attendant approached, offering Cassius a pair of wings to pin to his shirt for our junior flyer. With a smile, Cassius grinned and pinned the wings to his chest with pride. Aurelia thanked the attendant and leaned back in her seat. feeling a sense of peace she hadn't felt during their last trip. As the plane took off, Cassius pressed his face against the window, marveling at the clouds once more. For Dorian, Blackwell, Celestine, Aurelia, and Cassius, the incident on Flight 287 had set off a chain of events none of them could have predicted. It had exposed flaws, forced difficult conversations, and sparked meaningful change. And while the journey wasn't over for any of them, each had found a way to take the lessons of that day and move forward, wiser, stronger, and more determined to make things better. The lesson drawn from this story is the importance of sensitivity, compassion, and respectful communication, especially when dealing with customers and colleagues. The narrative shows that careless words and actions can deeply hurt people, alienate customers, and damage an organization's reputation. When small issues are mishandled, it can lead to severe consequences, such as inappropriate disciplinary measures and a negative impact on team morale. In contrast, fair and decisive intervention by leadership not only resolved the immediate problem, but also protected customer rights and set the stage for positive internal changes. Each individual must take a hard look at their behavior, learn from their mistakes, and work to improve how they interact with others. This commitment to personal growth helps build a more professional and friendly work environment. At the same time, organizations should invest in comprehensive training programs that focus on bias awareness and emotional intelligence. Such programs foster empathy and mutual respect, ensuring that everyone is treated with the dignity they deserve. Ultimately, these efforts create a better, more inclusive workplace for all. This is a crucial lesson. Thank you for watching. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe to our channel for more captivating and unforgettable stories. Stay tuned for more exciting content coming your way. See you in the next one.